Michael Grant sat in silence at the kitchen table, his dinner untouched and long gone cold. The microwave clock glowed, 9:40 p.m. Julia, his wife of 12 years, was absent again. Lately, her evenings at the office had become a pattern that unsettled him. She claimed she was working late, sorting through end-of-quarter reports or catching up on administrative tasks for Healing Hands, the nonprofit she directed. But something felt off. He tapped a slow rhythm on the tabletop, thoughts circling back to the little red flags that had crept into his mind over the past few weeks. They had always operated as a team, shared ambitions, shared calendars, even shared passwords. Julia was meticulous about updating that calendar. Openness was a pillar of their relationship, almost ritual. So when she started disappearing for work-related obligations, Michael did what he always did, checked their synced planner. Nothing was listed. No late-night board meetings, no scheduled donor events, no notes at all. Earlier that night, Michael had returned late from a client meeting. The house was unusually quiet, dark, eerily so. The inviting glow that typically poured from their craftsman-style home was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt foreign. Even the porch light, which Julia usually kept on for him, was off. Her car was in the driveway, yet she wasn't nestled on the couch with a book like most evenings. Baffled, he stepped inside, water dripping steadily from his overcoat. The living room was barren, the kitchen spotless, unnaturally so. He turned on a lamp and happened to glance at the oven clock. 11:05 p.m. Then the faint sound of the side gate shifting caught his attention, followed by the distinct click of a key sliding into the door lock. He instinctively stepped back, cloaking himself in the hallway shadows. The door connecting the garage to the kitchen opened slowly. Julia stepped through, her form outlined by the drizzle behind her before she quietly shut the door. She didn't see him standing there. Normally, they collaborated frequently. Michael even pitched in on her work when needed. So when he'd once offered to help with a presentation a week earlier, her reaction had startled him. She had stiffened momentarily before forcing a smile. "That's sweet, Mike, but it's just really technical. Board-level data," she had said breezily. "Confidential stuff? I can't share it. Not even with you." Her voice was light, but her eyes refused to meet his. That exchange had stayed with him. He knew what confidential meant. He was a CFO at a different nonprofit. He understood the boundaries, the sensitivity. But between couples, especially those in overlapping industries, it wasn't uncommon to bounce ideas off each other. Her refusal felt like a boundary newly erected, one that had never been there before. He remembered watching her leave earlier that evening, laptop slung over her shoulder. She'd kissed him lightly on the cheek. "Don't wait up," she'd murmured. He had caught a whiff of that new perfume, the one she only ever wore on Wednesdays. And lately she guarded her phone like it was sacred, never setting it face up anymore. Some nights she came home with the faint scent of whiskey lingering, despite her saying she'd been at dry, alcohol-free work events. Each moment might have seemed harmless on its own. But together, they formed a pattern, a chilling symmetry that he couldn't ignore. And tonight, standing in the shadows, he felt something click into place. A picture he'd been too afraid to outline now stared back at him, undeniable. He remained motionless until he heard the faint creak of their bedroom door upstairs closing. Only then did he release the breath that had tightened in his chest. His fingers trembled. An icy blend of fear and fury coursed through him. He didn't have answers yet, but he had a starting point. Later, he slipped quietly into bed beside her, careful not to wake her. But sleep refused him. In the hush of their bedroom, he listened to her gentle breathing and stared up into the dark, wondering what truth might lie behind the peaceful mask she wore in her sleep. It was the first of many nights he would spend like that, eyes wide open, heart beating steadily in a silence that screamed, as far from rest as he'd ever been. The next morning, he pretended everything was fine. Over breakfast, Julia was cheerful, though a little bleary-eyed. She smiled warmly as she packed Ethan's lunchbox, chatting as their 7-year-old tugged at her sleeve. Michael said nothing. But something had changed. Now he was watching. Brennan took a slow sip of coffee, watching her from beneath lowered lashes. She chatted animatedly about a new case at the firm, carefully sidestepping his eyes each time he responded with a quiet murmur. When she kissed their son Ethan goodbye and drove off in her pristine sedan, Brennan stayed behind at the kitchen table, his thoughts looping endlessly over what had happened the night before. If Hannah was cheating, she was executing it with the precision of a spreadsheet, methodical, well-timed, and expertly hidden. His jaw tightened as suspicion gripped him. Whatever this was, he intended to handle it like he would a case, calmly, thoroughly, and with a relentless focus on the facts. He didn't confront her. That wasn't his way. Instead, Brennan spent the next 21 days in quiet observation, collecting evidence with the same meticulous care he once reserved for dusting prints at a crime scene. Week after week, Wednesday came and went. Each time, Hannah arrived home late like a shadow slipping through the door, offering vague explanations. Each detail Brennan uncovered only hardened his resolve. He played the part of the pleasant husband and dependable father during the day, masking his growing resentment with routine pleasantries and hollow smiles. But once night fell, he became something else entirely, a man investigating the woman he'd once trusted with his life. Often he'd lie wide awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while Hannah slept beside him, wondering if he should wake her and demand the truth. But the thought of hearing her deny everything, even when the facts stared her in the face, silenced him. Her professional life had shifted last year, and a key figure in that transformation was Daniel Wu, a donor relations consultant known for his charm and effectiveness. Daniel had an impressive reputation for unlocking generosity, and under his influence, Healing Hands had nearly tripled its fundraising numbers in less than 2 years. The board adored him. Julia sang his praises constantly. Michael had met him several times at galas and fundraising dinners. Daniel had a polished ease about him, always ready with a compliment or a clever remark. Michael recalled one particular night, a celebratory dinner downtown, thrown after Healing Hands secured a $1 million grant. Julia had invited Michael to join the team. Daniel had been there, raising a glass in Julia's honor. He'd been gracious, engaging Michael in conversation about his own nonprofit work, disarming with his charm. Brennan later sat down with their billing statements, lining them up against their shared family calendar. Every charge matched a night Hannah had claimed to be working late or dining with colleagues. One date made his hands tremble, the evening of Ethan's school performance. Hannah had said she had a meeting that ran long. Brennan vividly remembered sitting in the auditorium, Ethan nervously tugging at his sleeve, the seat next to them conspicuously empty. He remembered Ethan's disappointment when Hannah never appeared. Now he knew the truth. She had been at the Lantern, sipping drinks while her family waited. The betrayal cut like glass. Swallowing the rising fury, Brennan forced himself to stay composed, to think like the investigator he was. He noticed with grim relief that there were no hotel bills or strange gift purchases. A small comfort, perhaps. Or maybe just proof that whatever was going on stayed confined to whiskey-soaked conversations and stolen time inside Daniel's carefully crafted world. Brennan marked every Lantern visit on the statements and copied them for safekeeping. Each slip of paper, plain and unremarkable, was a breadcrumb leading him closer to the truth. But papers weren't enough. Brennan needed to see the place for himself. The next evening, he made his way to the Lantern. It was sleek, modern, a bar with soft amber light and mahogany accents that gleamed in the low glow. Brennan took a seat at the bar in his blazer and open-collar shirt, blending seamlessly with the after-work crowd, and ordered a bourbon neat. He scanned the room between slow sips of the smoky liquor. Was it here that Hannah and Daniel leaned in close, whispering in a shadowed booth while he read Ethan his bedtime story? His grip tightened involuntarily around the glass. He caught a couple in the mirror behind the bar, tucked away in a booth, laughing quietly. For a moment his vision wavered. He imagined Hannah leaning toward Daniel, smiling in the low light. Blinking the image away, he took another sip to steady his nerves. When the bartender passed again, Brennan cleared his throat and gestured toward the back of the room. "Pretty lively for midweek," he said casually. The man grinned, sleeves rolled high. "Wednesdays are solid. We've got our regulars." "Nice place," Brennan replied, lying easily. "First time here. Meeting a colleague." He pulled out his phone, pretending to check a text. Later that night, when Julia finally slipped into bed well past midnight, Michael lay still, pretending to sleep. She moved carefully, like she could sense the growing distance between them. His eyes burned in the darkness. Whether from fatigue or the sting of unshed tears, he couldn't tell. He breathed evenly, pretending not to hear her soft sigh, one that sounded like she carried a weight too heavy to name. Before the sun rose, Michael was in the kitchen, grinding coffee beans with a newfound clarity. If something was broken between them, he would uncover the truth, one piece at a time. Michael's thoughts were already racing, carefully laying the groundwork to unearth the truth without losing sight of who he was. As morning light crept into the room, he found himself seated once more at the kitchen table. Steady, determined. He would pursue clarity, something he prized deeply, and let the evidence reveal the rest. The bartender's casual comment struck like a match on dry paper. Brennan could almost see Hannah sitting here not long ago, her expression bright with excitement, an expression he hadn't seen in ages, as she leaned into Daniel, hanging on his words, laughing at something he'd said. He closed his tab, left a generous gratuity, and stepped into the damp Cleveland night. Downtown city lights bled red and white through the light drizzle as he made his way to the car. He had come for validation of what he feared, and now the truth stared back at him, unflinching. Each new piece of the puzzle drove another wedge between him and the life he'd built, a blow to his marriage and more ammunition for whatever battle lay ahead. Parking lot logs. Brennan's focus shifted now to Daniel Travers, the man he believed had captured Hannah's affections in secret. Travers was the voice behind a well-known late-night show on WCLR, one of Cleveland's biggest radio stations. Brennan suspected that on those nights when Hannah vanished for hours, she might have been slipping off to see Daniel, either during or after his on-air segments. Ellen mused, thoughtful. We do routine internal checks, sure, but the last time we had an independent audit? Maybe 2 years ago. Why do you ask? In the driver's seat, Michael leaned back, his fingers loosening his tie absent-mindedly. Well, he began casually, in my experience, transparency really matters to donors. With all the recent growth in contributions, it might be wise to schedule a standard audit. Just to reassure everyone that the surge in funds is being handled with complete integrity, he paused, then added, Julia's always been a strong advocate for accountability. Honestly, a lot of our practices were shaped by her example. I'd imagine she'd agree that bringing in an outside firm is just smart stewardship. He didn't like using Julia's reputation this way, but he wasn't lying. She had consistently championed external audits. Publicly opposing the idea now would only raise eyebrows. He could practically hear Ellen nodding on the line. That's a valid point, she agreed, especially with the gala coming up and all those donors in one room. It'd be a strong statement if we could say we just completed a clean, independent audit. Michael's stomach tightened. The gala. He'd nearly forgotten. The Hope Gala was Healing Hands' premier annual event, a celebration of the charity's work attended by major benefactors, public figures, and the media. Julia had been pouring herself into the preparations for months. The timing couldn't have been more revealing. Exactly, Michael said smoothly. If you'd like, I know a few reputable audit firms I could connect you with. Actually, I'd be happy to volunteer some time coordinating. I speak the financial language, and it might help move things along before the gala. That would be wonderful, Michael, Ellen replied, clearly relieved. I'll bring it up with the executive committee this afternoon. I doubt there'll be any objections, not even from Julia. Everyone knows you're someone we can trust. Having you involved will make the whole process easier. After ending the call, Michael let out a slow breath. Step 1 was underway. A knot twisted in his chest. He was, in effect, initiating an audit behind Julia's back, calling her leadership into question. But he reassured himself he wasn't doing anything underhanded. Healing Hands didn't belong to Julia. It was a public organization, and if something wasn't right, the board had an obligation to find out. If everything was in order, all the better. Donors deserved that peace of mind. Later that same day, an email arrived. The board had approved the proposal. An immediate independent financial audit was a go. Included in the thread was Julia's reply, "Of course. I fully support the audit. Transparency is a foundational principle at Healing Hands." Michael read her message twice, scanning for any subtle sign of unease. There was nothing overt. In public, she presented herself as the picture of cooperative leadership, but he couldn't help wondering what she truly felt behind closed doors. Did the thought of the audit make her anxious, or was she certain that nothing incriminating would turn up? Later that week, the auditors, a well-regarded neutral firm, arrived at Healing Hands to begin their assessment. Michael, as promised, volunteered to serve as a liaison. Officially, he was there to assist due to his expertise in finance. Unofficially, he was determined to examine every ledger and statement himself. On Thursday morning, he entered the Healing Hands office wearing the mask of helpful support. It was odd stepping into the building not as Julia's spouse, but as something else entirely. Staff greeted him warmly. He was no stranger to the organization. For years, Michael had been a familiar face at fundraising events and an occasional voice of advice on financial matters. Though the welcome was polite, he noticed a subtle rigidity in Julia when they briefly passed each other in the hallway. She approached with a professional demeanor, her smile careful and restrained. "Thanks for being here, Michael. The audit team is set up in the conference room," she said. "Let me know if they or you need anything." Her voice was courteous, yet her jaw was tight. "I'm sure the process will be smooth," he answered, mirroring her formal tone. "It's encouraging to see Healing Hands taking this step willingly." He looked into her eyes, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman he knew so well. But Julia's face was unreadable, guarded under the calm mask of leadership. She gave a small nod, then turned and walked away briskly, her heels echoing across the tiled corridor. Michael drew in a breath and entered the conference room, where two auditors had already laid claim to the space. Laptops were open and piles of files and ledgers blanketed the table. One of them, Alan Ross, an older man in a sharp suit with gray at his temples, reached out to shake his hand. "Glad to have your support, Michael. It helps to have someone invested in the organization's integrity. If anything's unclear, contracts, accounting standards, whatever you need, just ask," Michael said, taking a seat across from them. Later that evening, Julia had let her usually tidy hair fall in soft waves. She wore a deep plum pea coat, one she used to save for special outings. She hadn't dressed up like that in months, not since they last went out as a family. As Daniel unlocked the door of a sleek silver BMW at the curb, Hannah lightly placed a hand on his back, an understated but intimate gesture. He opened the passenger door and she slid inside, casting a quick look over her shoulder, a cautious glance as if to check for prying eyes. From behind the row of planters, Brennan stayed frozen, silently snapping photo after photo. In the camera's frame, his wife looked like someone he didn't recognize, a woman climbing into her lover's car beneath the cover of night. Someone who had perfected the art of deception while standing in full view of those who trusted her. Once Daniel got behind the wheel, the headlights lit up and the car rolled into the quiet street. Back in the audit, under a generic line item labeled Staff Training and Development, Michael spotted repeated payments to Wu Consulting LLC, Daniel's company. The transactions were marked as training sessions for staff, but something about the numbers felt off. Each invoice was nearly double the standard consulting rate for their region. Michael, well-versed in market costs, immediately raised a mental red flag. He casually mentioned it to the auditors. "These consulting fees seem a bit steep, don't they? Could we look at the original invoices and any agreements with Wu Consulting?" Alan gave a nod and scribbled a note. Soon, the original paperwork was brought in. Michael's jaw clenched as he reviewed the contents. Each monthly invoice from Daniel's firm was filled with vague descriptions. Strategic donor outreach training, capacity building workshops. But there were no records, no reports, no participant lists, no workshop dates. The services were described in broad, ambiguous terms, and Julia had approved every payment. If those trainings had actually taken place, surely she would have mentioned them, maybe even invited other staff to attend. She hadn't said a word. The total amount paid over the year was eye-popping. Daniel's company had received over 6 figures from Healing Hands. Michael felt fury begin to boil. Healing Hands wasn't a massive charity. Every cent was meant for vaccines, for medical gear, for actual aid. Witnessing the potential misuse of such substantial funds wasn't merely a violation of trust within a marriage. It cut deeper. It was an ethical breach. Although he hadn't drawn any firm conclusions yet, a fierce sense of injustice began to take root inside Michael. He turned his attention next to the organization's travel records and meeting schedules. He specifically asked for documentation tied to travel reimbursements and site inspections, particularly those involving Daniel. One entry stood out immediately. Daniel had submitted numerous reimbursement claims for travel to a clinic development project in the heart of the city, conveniently located near Healing Hands' central office. Carefully, Brennan assembled the evidence. He tucked a photograph into a manila envelope, alongside printed credit card statements, a valet's note from the garage, and a USB drive containing footage from the building's hallway camera. He wound the string of the envelope tight and locked it away in a discreet wall safe, concealed behind a sliding shelf of books. All the details, every piece of what Hannah had done, were now safely sealed, factual and organized, hidden behind metal and wood. Before leaving for the night, Brennan stepped across the hallway and slowly nudged Ethan's bedroom door open. The nightlight gave the room a soft, bluish hue. He saw his son curled under the blankets, a frayed, stuffed dinosaur clutched gently in one arm. Ethan's breaths were slow and even. His small face was calm, untouched by the unraveling chaos around him. Brennan stood quietly in the doorway, his throat tightening as he listened to the gentle rhythm of his son's breathing. Each breath reminded him of what truly mattered. Julia and Daniel had used Healing Hands' financial resources as a cover to sustain their affair. They'd masked their meetings as business obligations, billing the charity to make their encounters seem legitimate. Michael felt his throat constrict. He stepped out of the conference room, pacing slowly toward the water cooler. He needed a moment to steady his hands and his resolve. This wasn't mere suspicion anymore. It was confirmed. Black ink on white paper. As he drank, he spotted Julia down the corridor, speaking with her assistant. She looked worn down, her fingers pressed to her temples in quiet frustration. For a fleeting moment, Michael felt a flicker of sympathy. She had been under enormous pressure lately, organizing the gala, managing operations. But then the reality returned like a stone in his chest. Julia had made a choice. Whatever burdens she carried, she had opted to layer deceit on top of them. When Michael rejoined the auditors, he was more resolute than ever. Would it be possible to review selected email communications? He asked Alan and his colleague. Specifically, between leadership and any key consultants or donors. The board may want to confirm that consultant correspondence aligns with the invoices we've reviewed. The two auditors exchanged a brief, cautious look. Email access can be a delicate area, Alan admitted. But if vendor payment seems suspicious, it may fall within the scope of the audit. However, we might need formal board approval to proceed with reviewing specific messages. Michael had already anticipated this hurdle. I'll take care of it, he assured them. That same evening, Michael initiated a formal complaint under Healing Hands' whistleblower policy, a system every credible nonprofit maintained to allow internal concerns to be raised safely and confidentially. Through that channel, he submitted a detailed report to the audit committee. He outlined irregular payments to a consultant, deliberately avoiding mention of his personal ties to the case. To justify accessing email records, he framed the concern around possible conflicts of interest and potential financial misconduct. Ellen, who chaired the audit committee, moved quickly. She authorized the auditors, and Michael, acting as liaison, to collect and examine email exchanges involving Julia, Daniel, and any reference to Wu Consulting or affiliated projects. When the email archives arrived, Michael prepared himself for what he might find. He stayed late in the conference room, its corners quiet and shadowed. The laptop screen glowed in the dim light, reflecting faintly in his glasses. With a few strategic keywords and date filters, the emails surfaced. A long thread of correspondence between Julia and Daniel stretching back months. Every click opened a fresh wound. In one message titled Strategy Proposal, the subtext was unmistakably personal. They discussed scheduling meetings interspersed with flirtatious comments. Daniel had written, "Let's make tomorrow's strategy session a little more hands-on. I'll bring the wine." Julia replied, "You're awful, LOL. But yes, more hands-on fundraising is exactly what I need." Reading those lines made Michael's stomach twist. Still, he pressed on. In another email, they discussed launching a for-profit venture. Julia proposed spinning off a segment of Healing Hands, the clinic development arm, into a private company. "If we design it properly," she typed, "the nonprofit can seed it with foundation grants, and then private capital can step in afterward. Daniel, I want you involved. With your abilities, you've earned a share in the rewards. I'll make sure you get equity once everything's in motion. Our own initiative, just picture it. Creating impact and gaining returns. Together." Michael clenched his fists. There it was, plain as day. Julia was offering Daniel a financial incentive, tied to a venture that should have remained purely philanthropic. This wasn't just about romance or physical betrayal. This was a betrayal of ideals. She was prepared to compromise Healing Hands' mission for personal benefit, and she was drawing Daniel in with the promise of ownership. Michael felt sick. He kept digging. There were more messages, emails where they coordinated their stories. One particularly damning thread around the time of their strategic retreats had Julia advising Daniel on how to format his billing. "Try calling it training support or outreach assistance," she wrote. "Don't list it as consulting hours, it's cleaner that way." Daniel answered in a flippant tone, "Whatever you need, I'm good at covering our bases." Michael read line after line, each one landing like a punch. He quietly printed copies, emails, invoices, flight receipts, and assembled them piece by piece into a private, comprehensive dossier. Late into the night, long after most had gone home, and the janitorial crew's vacuums hummed in the background, Michael sat alone in the conference room, documents strewn in front of him like the wreckage of trust, under the sterile brightness of overhead lights. He stared at the hard proof of Julia's deception and let the full weight of it settle. His eyes filled, not from weakness, but from fury and heartbreak. One hand pressed to his forehead. He tried to still the rising tide of emotion. In that stillness, a grim clarity emerged. This wasn't only about Julia and Daniel violating his trust. They had betrayed everyone who had placed faith in them. The board, the donors, and most importantly, the very people Healing Hands was built to serve. This was more than a personal affair. It was a betrayal of the organization's soul. With great care, Michael folded the file shut. His hand trembled for a moment over the cover, then stilled. He knew what had to come next. Transparency wasn't a slogan, it was a principle, the bedrock of everything they claimed to uphold. Their entire careers were built on the belief that doing good demanded honesty. Julia had abandoned that ideal. So be it. He wasn't a man of revenge. Personally, he was shattered, tempted to confront Julia directly, to demand answers, to scream. But he suppressed that instinct. Private confrontation wouldn't be enough. The harm was public, the reckoning had to be too. Julia and Daniel had violated public trust and misused charitable resources. This truth needed to be aired, not just for justice, but for the sake of the mission itself. Michael closed his laptop and stood to leave. Then Ellen's comment from earlier floated back to him. A passing mention of the upcoming gala. A plan began to form. The Hope Gala was only 2 weeks away. It was a high-profile event, an ideal stage to restore truth. Revealing something so explosive in such a setting would be bold, risky even. But wasn't that the essence of accountability? Besides, a part of him couldn't deny it. There was something poetic in letting Julia and Daniel face consequences, in the presence of those they had fooled. News of what happened reached Brennan through informal channels. Word was that very morning, WCLR's general manager had called Daniel Travers in, armed with the anonymous packet. The manager confronted him. Daniel reportedly turned ghostly white, protesting at first, sputtering about misunderstandings, until the photo surfaced. At that moment, Cleveland's smooth-talking late-night host fell silent. Within the hour, security walked him out of the station. The once proud voice of WCLR was left speechless, in the face of irrefutable evidence. When Brennan heard, he allowed himself a quiet, restrained smile. The station had acted. That evening, during the hour Daniel's show would have aired, WCLR broadcasted something else entirely. A serene live piano performance. In the background, a celebratory reception unfolded. Donors, civic leaders, and staff gathered to honor Healing Hands and its achievements. At the entrance stood a striking banner. Annual Hope Gala, Building Healthy Futures. Julia had gone above and beyond in pulling the event together. Not a single element had been left to chance. Michael adjusted his black bow tie with measured precision. Though turmoil simmered beneath his calm facade, he presented an image of control. As he entered the grand ballroom, his eyes immediately found Julia across the space. She moved with ease through the crowd, radiant in a sapphire gown, her expression warm as she welcomed a city council member. A brief wave of sorrow passed through Michael. She still embodied the dynamic, magnetic leader who had once captivated him completely. Yet that image clashed sharply with the truth tucked inside his jacket, a USB stick containing damning evidence of her wrongdoing. Elsewhere in the room, Daniel Wu mingled with affluent donors. Sharp in his tailored suit, his charm flowed effortlessly. He laughed easily, offered firm handshakes, and seemed to draw smiles from every conversation. Michael watched as Daniel jovially clasped an elderly donor's shoulder, and a flash of fury welled up. This was the man who had propelled their fundraising into the stratosphere, on a foundation of deceit. Daniel's success had been built by crossing lines that should never have been breached. Michael struggled to keep his expression neutral, resisting the urge to scowl. Instead, he offered a cordial nod to a few familiar benefactors, choosing patience over confrontation. The formal portion of the evening was approaching. By prior agreement with Ellen and the board, Michael had been granted a brief speaking slot at the start of the program. Officially, he was there to offer thanks as a representative of the Financial Oversight Committee, a temporary title the board had quietly assigned him for the evening. Julia had raised an eyebrow when she first saw Michael's name on the draft agenda, slated for opening remarks. But Ellen had smoothly explained it away. Since Michael had assisted with coordinating the financial review, it only made sense for him to share the positive results. With no graceful way to object, Julia had agreed, though Michael had caught the flicker of suspicion in her eyes when she saw him leave earlier with his laptop in hand. At last, the house lights dimmed, gently directing attention toward the stage. The hum of conversation faded to silence. Julia stepped up to the podium, poised and radiant under the spotlight. Her voice rang out with poise and warmth as she welcomed the assembled guests. "Thank you all for joining us this evening," she said. "Your support brings healing and hope to communities around the world." She gestured toward the elegantly decorated room. "This gala is our opportunity to honor each of you, our donors, allies, and friends who make our mission possible." Predictably, applause rose from the tables. Michael stood just off stage, hands folded behind him, maintaining an appearance of ease. Inside, his pulse was quick and loud. He spotted Daniel seated near the front, casually sipping from a glass, clearly unaware of what was about to unfold. After a few more introductory remarks, Julia continued, "Here at Healing Hands, we pride ourselves on transparency and accountability." She smiled, though Michael thought he detected a trace of tension in the gesture. "That's why we recently undertook a thorough, independent financial audit, to ensure that every dollar entrusted to us is used wisely." She paused, then added, "To say a few words about that process, and to extend our thanks, I'd like to welcome someone you all know well. My husband and our volunteer liaison to the audit team, Michael Grant." Applause followed, polite but attentive. Michael stepped into the light, meeting Julia briefly as she stepped aside. He caught her glance. Was that doubt behind her smile? Whatever it was, it vanished as she turned and retreated to a nearby spot, her hands now folded in front of her. Michael scanned the room, taking in the expectant faces. He saw Ellen seated with a group of board members, offering quiet encouragement with her nod. He saw Julia standing a few steps away, composed yet watchful. And he saw Daniel, still at ease, now with a mild expression of curiosity. "Good evening," Michael began, his voice clear and even across the speakers. "On behalf of Healing Hands, I'd like to echo Julia's heartfelt thanks. It's your generosity that powers our work." He allowed himself a measured smile. "As Julia mentioned, we've just concluded an independent audit of our financial operations. I had the honor of helping coordinate that effort." From the audience, a few donors exchanged pleased glances. A completed audit was always a sign of good stewardship. Michael went on, "Tonight, in the spirit of openness, we'd like to highlight some of the findings from that audit. Because you, our partners, deserve full clarity about how your contributions are being used to change lives." He noticed a subtle shift in Julia's expression. Her smile stiffened ever so slightly. Daniel, too, seemed to sit a little taller in his seat, as if finally sensing that something had changed. Michael tapped the button on the remote he held. Behind him, a pair of massive screens flanking the stage blinked on. They displayed the title slide he had meticulously prepared. Healing Hands, Independent Financial Review, Key Insights. Though the wording was neutral, the sudden appearance of a visual aid sent a ripple of curiosity through the audience. Michael's voice was calm as he spoke. "I'd like to bring Alan Ross up to the stage now. He's the lead partner at Ross & Myers Accounting, the firm that conducted the review." Alan, the auditor in question, made his way up the steps and accepted the microphone from Michael. He adjusted his tie, his presence steady and authoritative. "Thank you, Mr. Grant," he began. "Everyone, I'll keep this brief and spare you the deep dive into financials. The good news is, our audit confirms that Healing Hands is, for the most part, handling its finances responsibly. Donor contributions are being used largely for their intended purposes, and the internal checks in place are mostly reliable." Polite applause followed. From her seat, Julia acknowledged the statement with a cautious nod, her expression reserved. Her posture, however, remained tense. She knew instinctively there was more, and she was right. Alan took a deliberate pause, then went on. "That said, there are certain irregularities that we believe merit full disclosure in keeping with a transparent process." The word irregularities cut through the room like a sudden drop in temperature. A charged silence settled. A new slide appeared on screen, bearing the title, Expenses and Irregularities. A chart compared two columns, one from the official books, the other from the audit's findings. A category labeled Staff Training and Development showed a notable discrepancy. The actual figure from the audit was much higher than the one reported, and the difference was outlined in red. Alan continued, gesturing toward the figures with a laser pointer. "Our analysis revealed that a number of consultant fees had been incorrectly categorized as training expenses. In particular, one external consultant received compensation that far exceeded typical market rates, and these payments were misclassified." The numbers were plain to see, but what they implied, that was something deeper. Then, in a separate conversation elsewhere, "We need to establish how this connects to Ethan if we want it to carry weight in family court," Brennan said. Carla stirred sugar into her coffee without looking up. "I was thinking the same thing," she replied. "She's been skipping her evenings with him. I've got records of that, and I've filmed her getting home way past bedtime on school nights." The diner's fluorescent lights reflected dully off the worn Formica tabletop. Carla gave the coffee a slow stir, her mind clearly elsewhere. "If we frame this right, a judge could see it as neglect, especially with a kid that young. They don't like anything that disrupts a child's routine." She paused and looked Brennan directly in the eyes, her tone shifting to something more serious. "Brennan, are you absolutely certain you want to take this all the way? Once we go down this path, it won't be clean. It won't be civil. It becomes a full-scale battle." Brennan sat back, his eyes locked on the rising steam from his mug. "A battle." Yes, that word felt appropriate now. Back on stage, Alan spoke again. "We also found instances where travel expenses for site visits were reimbursed to the same consultant on dates that coincided with what were recorded as strategy meetings." Another slide appeared, a calendar with linked expense entries. Consultant lodging, downtown loft, 2 nights, among others. The dates weren't significant to donors, but Julia and Daniel, seated in the audience, would recognize them immediately. A low buzz of speculation began to spread across the room. From the front row, a donor leaned forward and asked, "What exactly are we looking at here?" Michael kept his tone level, almost neutral. "Based on the evidence, these expenditures don't appear to reflect legitimate business purposes. They occurred during periods where no documented meetings were scheduled." He didn't need to elaborate. The suggestion was enough. The implication of personal misuse was already taking root in the room. He had no intention of broadcasting the full story. The financial irregularities were scandal enough for now. Those able to read between the lines would draw their own conclusions. Then came the final slide. Words from an email, enlarged for clarity, filled the screen. Julia's eyes locked on them instantly. A sharp, quiet intake of breath escaped her lips, barely audible except to those nearby. But Michael heard it clearly. The excerpt read, "I promise you'll get equity in the new for-profit venture." A more involved approach to fundraising, apparently. Jay. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as realization dawned. Equity stakes? A for-profit model? Direct financial benefit from charitable efforts? The refined audience looked utterly stunned. This wasn't just a misstep. It felt like exploitation. A personal cash-in on what was meant to be a mission of goodwill. Julia opened her mouth, struggling for words that wouldn't come. She stood frozen, eyes fixed on the screen, stunned into silence. Daniel flushed a deep red. He started to rise, possibly to leave, but halted midway. The eyes at his table, from donors and colleagues alike, now filled with recognition and suspicion, silently ordered him to stay put. Alan Ross leaned toward the microphone again, his tone grave as he delivered the conclusion. When our investigation was complete, we presented these results to the Healing Hands Board of Directors. The board has pledged to act swiftly and decisively. We reveal this to you tonight because, as valued contributors and partners, you are owed complete transparency. The real betrayal occurs when nonprofit ideals are twisted for personal advantage, and while that truth is painful, openness is the first step toward restoring trust. The pianist, long attuned to the shifting mood, had stopped mid-piece. Silence took over, tense and unnatural, interrupted only by the occasional sharp breath and the soft fluttering of programs. Then the stares came. Dozens of eyes shifted to Julia, then to Daniel. For a moment, the entire room held its breath, suspended in a moment too heavy to move through. Then came the murmurs, faint at first, growing steadily. A woman in an elegant silver dress rose abruptly, glaring at Julia with indignation that bordered on rage. An elderly donor, leaning on a cane, shook his head slowly, pain and disappointment etched into his features. Julia stirred at last. "Everyone," she began, voice hoarse, reaching toward the microphone with an unsteady hand. Maybe to explain, maybe to plead. But Michael stepped forward, calm but resolute, positioning himself between her and the mic, not forcefully but undeniably. He looked her straight in the eyes, a silent warning not to interfere. Julia's expression broke. She stopped, and in that moment, she understood. Nothing she said now could erase what had already been revealed. Meanwhile, Daniel began to ease his way toward the side exit. Chairs subtly scraped aside to clear his path. People noticed. Whispers followed him. His face betrayed the shame he tried hard to contain, walking a tightrope between disgrace and dignity. No one tried to stop him. He wasn't obligated to explain, and maybe it was better this way. Staying might have only made things worse. Back on stage, Michael took a small step back, leaving the podium behind. His job here was finished. Alan nodded in appreciation before stepping off stage to rejoin the board, now huddled in hushed deliberation. Julia remained under the stage lights, alone, their glow suddenly feeling cold and cruel. Her eyes shimmered with tears she refused to shed. Once more she seemed about to speak, then thought better of it. From the audience, a single awkward clap broke the silence, then died just as quickly. No one quite knew how to act in the face of such public collapse. Michael stood still, emotions tangled inside him, a hollow kind of justice mixed with sorrow. This moment had been long coming. Julia had made her decisions, and now the outcome stood bare for all to witness. As he glanced across the room one final time, he took in the expressions: shock, anger, but also a few looks of quiet understanding aimed at him. Some in the room knew his story. Some understood this wasn't just business. It was personal. With a courteous nod to the audience, he stepped away from the spotlight. His part in this drama was over, at least for now. The room buzzed with renewed energy as conversations bloomed at every table, frantic and fragmented. Julia remained where she was, trembling, turning her eyes toward Michael with silent desperation. A single tear slid down her cheek. But Michael didn't stop. He didn't look back. He descended the stairs, leaving her to face the consequences she could no longer outrun. Chapter 4. Aftermath and Accountability. The gala ended abruptly in the wake of the bombshell. There were no speeches to close the evening, no music, no dancing. Donors drifted out in quiet clusters, speaking in hushed tones, still reeling. Yet a handful remained, those more devoted to the mission than shaken by the scandal, seeking reassurances from board members that their support still meant something. Ellen Pierce, along with the other board members, pledged to take decisive corrective action and extended heartfelt gratitude to donors for their patience during a turbulent moment. As soon as Michael stepped down from the stage, Julia slipped away from view. When he glanced back across the room, she had already disappeared, likely pulled aside into a private room by a few board members for an urgent conversation. Daniel had also made a quick exit and was nowhere to be seen. The polished evening Julia had spent countless hours orchestrating had unraveled into a scene of quiet crisis and suppressed fury. Michael didn't linger either. Once he was certain that Ellen and the rest of the leadership were in control, he collected his coat and exited the grand hall. A sense of emptiness settled over him as he stepped into the brisk night air. None of them had imagined the night ending like this. And yet, in some ways, it was the only conclusion that felt justified. As he drove home, the rush of adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation began to wear off, leaving behind an overwhelming sorrow. The marriage he had once cherished now lay in ruins, exposed in its ugliest form for all to see. Shortly before midnight, his phone lit up with a message from Ellen. Board met. Julia removed as ED effective immediately. Unanimous vote. We'll go over details tomorrow. Michael let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was final. Julia's leadership at Healing Hands had officially come to an end. The words carried the weight of irrevocability. She hadn't just hurt him. She had obliterated the very foundation of her professional legacy in a single evening. The following morning, events moved quickly. An emergency meeting of the Healing Hands Board was called at their headquarters. Michael was asked to attend, not only as someone familiar with the audit findings, but also because, in the wake of the chaos, the board now counted him among the few they could wholly rely on. Julia was present too, at least at the beginning. She sat quietly at the far end of the conference table, noticeably diminished from her usual authoritative self. Her face was pale, her posture subdued, and the deep shadows beneath her eyes revealed a sleepless night. The mood in the room was tense, edged with sadness. The board's legal counsel was patched in by phone. Ellen Pierce chaired the meeting, her usual warmth replaced with measured detachment. With the seriousness of the audit findings and the confirmed breach of ethical standards, she began with careful control, this board has voted unanimously to remove Julia Grant from her role as executive director, effective immediately. She glanced around the room. Every board member present either nodded silently or murmured their assent, some visibly upset, others visibly angry. Julia lowered her head. She offered no argument. There was nothing left to contest. The proof against her was overwhelming. Her voice, though trembling, broke the silence. "I understand," she said. "I accept responsibility. For all of it." Her eyes were rimmed with red as she fought to stay composed. I'm truly sorry for the damage I've caused." Around the table, a few board members wrestled with their reactions. The sense of betrayal was undeniable, but so was their sorrow. Julia had once been a respected colleague, even a friend. Watching her unravel like this was painful, no matter the facts. The lawyer's voice crackled through the speaker. "There is also the issue of your employment agreement," he said. "In light of the confirmed misconduct and policy violations, the board is proceeding with termination for cause. That voids any severance entitlements outlined in your contract." Julia swallowed. She had, in more stable times, secured a generous exit package. Now, faced with its erasure, she didn't so much as flinch. "I won't dispute it," she said softly. "I waive all claims to severance." Whether it was the weight of guilt or the awareness that she had no ground left to stand on, she didn't try to fight. The voice that once commanded rooms now sounded defeated. Michael observed everything from his seat in the corner, deliberately positioned away from the table. He didn't want it to appear as though he were celebrating this downfall or steering the outcome. He felt no sense of victory, only sorrow. Julia never looked in his direction, and he made no effort to catch her gaze. The board's attention shifted next to the matter of Daniel Wu. Though not officially on staff, his role as a consultant for Healing Hands was terminated on the spot, with formal documentation already dispatched. Rumors had begun leaking beyond the confines of the gala. By sunrise, word had rippled through the local non-profit circles. A prominent charitable group had been swept into a scandal involving ethics violations. Daniel's most valuable asset, his good name, was now worthless. Board members one after another relayed that their phones had been buzzing with calls and texts. Is it true? Did your consultant really defraud the organization? In the close-knit world of philanthropy, a breach this serious can follow someone forever. Ellen, reading from her tablet, informed the board that Daniel had stepped down from every position he held with other nonprofits. He didn't wait to be officially cut off. Growing pressure from betrayed partners had forced his hand. Major institutions quietly scrubbed his name from their lists of trusted advisors. And behind closed doors, a consensus took shape. Daniel Wu would not be invited back into the fold, at least not in this community. A board member, a well-known leader in business, gave a regretful shake of her head. He had such promise, and he wasted it. None of my peers will ever hire him again. There remained one final decision. Should the case be referred to the authorities or regulatory bodies, considering the potential for fraud? The charity's attorney explained that legal action was indeed possible. If funds had been misused, the organization had the right to pursue compensation. But the stakes were high. A lawsuit could stretch the story out in the press, doing more damage to Healing Hands' public image. Ultimately, the board agreed to resolve the matter out of court. Julia would sign a statement admitting to misconduct, reimburse any clearly inappropriate expenses, like those travel costs, and in return, the charity would drop any pursuit of legal consequences. It was a bitter pill, sparing her criminal charges in exchange for safeguarding the organization's future. Julia didn't protest. Throughout the proceedings, she sat silently, nodding to every condition put forth. She looked depleted, beyond resistance. As the meeting neared its end, attention shifted to what lay ahead for Healing Hands. Donors needed assurance that the organization remained committed to its mission. Employees needed guidance. With no executive director in place, the organization couldn't afford to drift without direction. It was then that Ellen addressed Michael directly for the first time that morning, drawing every eye to him. "Michael," she said, "your courage in exposing what was wrong and doing so with care to protect Healing Hands means a great deal." Michael shifted in his chair. "I only did what I believed was necessary," he replied. "The mission matters too much to be undermined." Ellen gave a small, sincere smile. "Exactly, which is why I, and the rest of the board, have a request." The other members leaned forward slightly. Several already wore knowing expressions. "Would you consider stepping in as interim executive director during this transitional period? We realize it's a significant ask. Your own organization would have to make adjustments to allow it, but no one is better suited to stabilize things. The donors trust your judgment. The team respects you. And after last night, everyone recognizes your integrity." Michael was caught off guard. He hadn't looked this far ahead. His goal had been to confront the wrongdoing and ensure it stopped, not to take on a leadership role in the aftermath. He looked around the table. What he saw was not pressure but hope. Healing Hands was standing on the edge of a cliff. An immediate decision had to be made. Someone reliable had to step in now, or the organization risked donor backlash and a demoralized team. Michael noticed Julia still sitting quietly across the room. When Ellen floated the idea, Julia finally lifted her gaze toward Michael. Her expression was layered: guilt, sadness, and perhaps even a trace of relief that someone competent might be able to pick up the pieces she had left behind. Michael's thoughts drifted to the community clinics Healing Hands had established, to the people they served every day. He thought about the donors who had taken a chance on the organization, trusting in its mission, trust he had helped to rebuild by exposing the deception. His own nonprofit had skilled financial leads who could handle things in his absence, and his board would likely back his decision to help, given the extraordinary circumstances. This wasn't how he had imagined stepping into a leadership position, not like this, but it felt like a calling he couldn't, in good conscience, ignore. He sat a little taller. "If I can help healing hands recover," he said carefully, "then yes, I'll take it on. Temporarily. Until you find someone permanent." The tension in the room eased all at once. Ellen reached across and shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Michael. We'll make this official right away." And just like that, within a day of the scandal at the gala, Michael assumed the role Julia had vacated. The moment felt unreal, bittersweet. He would now sit at her desk, carrying out the mission she had nearly upended. As the meeting ended, board members rose and began to file out. Several approached Michael, offering quiet thanks. A few gave him reassuring pats on the shoulder. One leaned in and said quietly, "We're sorry you had to be the one to uncover it, but we're grateful you did." Michael offered only a nod. Julia remained seated while the others left the room. Michael was gathering his things to go when he heard her voice, soft, tentative. "Michael?" It was the first time she had spoken directly to him since the gala. He stopped, hand resting on the back of a chair, but didn't sit. He turned toward her, looking at the woman he once knew so intimately, now a stranger hollowed out by disgrace. "I'm so sorry," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. In a world built on hidden truths, Michael had been the one person who refused to ignore the signs. And in doing so, he had delivered justice, not through rage, but with the clarity and finality of a courtroom verdict. Later, in the solitude of his study, he would tuck the incriminating photo back into the safe, turn the key, and take a quiet sip of bourbon. Through the window, the Cleveland skyline blinked in the night, calm and distant. The storm had passed. The wounds had closed. But healing and restoration weren't the same thing. Some breaks never mend. Still, there was a certain balance now, a quiet resolution tinged with sadness, shaped by loss. A justice that came at a price, but one he could live with. Michael and Julia barely exchanged words. He poured himself into the day-to-day demands of the organization, working long hours to steady the ship. She stayed mostly in the guest room, rarely crossing his path, wrapped in her own remorse and grief. They treated each other cautiously, as though even small talk might crack the uneasy truce holding them together. By Thursday, Michael had reached a decision about the one matter still unspoken between them. Their marriage. It couldn't be salvaged. Not for him. The betrayal had cut too deep, and trust once shattered couldn't be rebuilt. Not in this lifetime. On Monday, the same day he agreed to serve as interim director, he had quietly met with a divorce attorney. The paperwork had been prepared swiftly, given the situation. That evening, he asked Julia to meet him in the study, one of the rare moments he initiated conversation. The study was a small, quiet space filled with books and framed achievements from both their careers. They had spent countless nights there, planning fundraisers, trading feedback on speeches, imagining a future that now seemed like someone else's dream. Now it would host their final reckoning. Julia stepped in hesitantly and took the leather chair across from his desk. She seemed anxious, her eyes flickering to the stack of papers neatly placed between them. Michael's expression was steady, calm but unreadable. He had arranged 3 items neatly on the wooden desk. A bound edition of the independent auditor's findings, a printed copy of the board's resolution removing her from her role, and the elegant program from the Hope Gala. Its cover, a vibrant photo of beaming children from the clinic, now felt like a cruel echo of the evening when everything unraveled. "Michael?" Her voice was tentative, barely above a whisper. "You said you wanted to talk?" Her tone was raw, her throat tight, as if the tears had only recently stopped. He gave a small nod, motioning toward the documents. "I think these speak for themselves," he said. His voice held a quiet steadiness, kind, almost gentle, but there was a controlled distance in it that made Julia shrink back. She looked down, her gaze moving from the gala program to the audit report, her expression breaking. A tear traced its way down her cheek. "I know," she murmured. I know I ruined everything. I don't have an excuse. I was wrong, completely. Michael took in a long, slow breath, grounding himself. Hearing her admit it stirred a storm inside him. Anger, grief, and a reluctant trace of sympathy for her pain. Still, he steeled himself. From a folder nearby, he drew out another set of papers. This time, legal ones. He placed the divorce forms gently atop the others. Julia's breath hitched the moment she recognized them. Her hand shot up to her mouth, stifling a sob. "Michael, no!" she gasped. He lifted his hand, not in reproach, but to silence her gently. "I'm not here to argue," he said softly. "I'm not going to lash out or say cruel things. We've moved past that." He met her eyes directly, his expression steeped in pain and resignation. "There's only one thing I need you to understand." She lowered her hand, nodding weakly, tears streaming down her face without resistance. Michael's voice quivered despite his effort to steady it. "I believed in what we were doing and in us," he said. "You chose something else." That broke her. Julia crumbled, burying her face in her hands as sobs overtook her. His words hovered in the room, sharp, final, and devastating. In just 2 sentences, he had captured the full weight of what had been lost. Their life, built on common purpose, shared convictions, and unspoken trust, had been undone by her decisions. Decisions that had betrayed both, the cause they had devoted themselves to, and the promises they made to each other. There was nothing left to say. After a while, Julia began to gather herself. She dabbed her cheeks and tentatively reached across the desk, fingers outstretched toward his hand. But she stopped short, drawing back before she could touch him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For all of it. I never wanted to hurt you or the foundation." Her voice broke again. "I lost my way. Somehow I forgot what really mattered. I don't even recognize the person I became." Her words spilled out, a last frantic attempt to make sense of what couldn't be undone. "If I could go back, God, I would. I was reckless and selfish." Michael remained still, saying nothing. Once he would have pulled her into his arms the moment she cried, but not now. It was as if he were observing the scene through a pane of thick, soundless glass, distant and detached. He could tell she was remorseful. Her voice carried the weight of sincerity, but none of it altered the final result. "I'm sorry too," he said at last, catching her off guard. She lifted her head, confusion mingling with her tears. "I'm sorry it had to end like this. Sorry that the woman I once loved, the partner I once counted on, is no longer standing in front of me, because I don't know who you are anymore, Julia." His words were heavy with sorrow, colored by a quiet finality. "The Julia I knew wouldn't have done any of this." She flinched, as if struck, a fresh ripple of anguish flashing across her expression. "I know," she whispered. "That version of me is gone. I wish I could go back, take it all back, and still be by your side, doing what mattered, like we used to." Her shoulders trembled with silent sobs. "But I can't. I know I can't." Michael felt the sting of tears pressing at his eyes. He blinked quickly, steadying himself. "I think it's time we let go," he said gently, his fingers resting on the divorce papers between them. "It's an uncontested petition. The reason listed is irreconcilable differences." He had chosen not to write infidelity, though in some jurisdictions it would have been valid grounds. It didn't matter anymore. The division of assets is equitable. "I don't want revenge, just peace. A clean, respectful parting." Julia reached for the papers with unsteady hands. As her eyes moved across the text, a tear landed on the page, blurring her signature. "Michael, is this really what you want?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, even though they both already knew the answer. "After everything, is there truly no hope left?" His chest tightened. How many sleepless nights had he spent haunted by that same question, praying this nightmare had another ending? But that hope had shattered the moment he saw those emails, undeniable proof in cold, hard text. His voice was quiet but unwavering. "No, Julia, we can't come back from this. Too much has been lost." He drew in a long breath. "You made your decision. Now I have to make mine." She closed her eyes, her head nodding slowly as fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. For a moment, the study was filled with nothing but the slow ticking of the clock on the mantel and the sound of her quiet weeping. At last, with trembling fingers, She picked up the pen from the desk. Without speaking, she signed her name where required. Each letter seemed to drain her strength, as though writing it sealed not just the paper but the end of what they once were. When she finished, she placed the pen down softly. "Thank you," Michael said as he took the signed documents. It wasn't gratitude for the situation, but perhaps for her acceptance of the inevitable, for not turning it into a battleground. Julia rose to her feet slowly. Her eyes scanned the room, eventually resting on a photo on the bookshelf. The two of them at the launch of a clinic abroad, smiles wide, arms entwined, radiating pride and shared purpose. She exhaled shakily, then turned to face him once more. "I mean it. I'm truly sorry," she said again. Michael gave a small nod in return. There was nothing left to add. Any path toward forgiveness, if it ever came, lay somewhere far down the road. For now, he needed distance, closure. He collected the documents and the folder of evidence from the desk. The weight in his hands felt symbolic, a physical echo of the emotional burden he'd carried for weeks. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. Julia didn't follow. She remained behind, the woman who had once shared his life, now reduced to a sorrowful silhouette in a quiet, broken space. At the threshold, he hesitated briefly, as if expecting one last word, one final gesture that might offer meaning beyond the pain. But the silence held. Michael gently closed the study door behind him. The soft snick of the door closing felt like the final punctuation mark on 12 years of marriage. There were no explosive arguments, no desperate pleas for reconciliation. Only a hushed, heartbreaking finality. Not forgiveness, just finality. The end. Half a year later, the golden light of late summer streamed into a small community center, where Healing Hands was experimenting with a different type of fundraiser. Gone were the tuxedos and silent auctions. In their place, Michael had arranged an informal Ask Me Anything gathering for patrons and volunteers. No champagne flutes or catered dinners, just sincere dialogue, lemonade in paper cups, homemade cookies, and poster boards showcasing the clinic's current initiatives. Michael stood at the front in a plain shirt, a clear podium in front of him, and rows of about 50 attendees in folding chairs. Many had been present at that now infamous fundraiser 6 months earlier, and notably, many had stayed loyal. Some had even remarked that their faith in the organization had deepened, because of the way the problems had been openly confronted and repaired. From the crowd, a woman in her 50s lifted her hand. She was a longtime supporter, one who'd been stunned by the prior controversy. Michael acknowledged her with a nod. "With all that's happened," she began carefully, "how can we be confident it won't happen again? I see the improvements, but rebuilding trust takes time." There was a low hum of agreement among the seated guests. Michael gave a slow, thoughtful nod. This was exactly the conversation he had hoped for. "That's a valid concern," he said, his tone open and sincere. "And you're absolutely right. Regaining trust isn't easy. Which is why we've taken tangible steps to keep Healing Hands moving forward with integrity." He advanced a slide on the projector behind him. The screen displayed a bullet point list. Independent audits every 6 months. Quarterly online financial statements. Open board Q&A forums. Anonymous whistleblower system. "We now have third-party auditors reviewing our finances twice a year," Michael explained. "Not because we expect trouble, but because early detection is key, and we have nothing to conceal. Every quarter, we release comprehensive financial reports. Anyone can view them online and see where every donation ends up. No more vague line items or buried costs. Complete clarity." The room was quiet, focused. A few attendees gave small nods, visibly comforted. "We also hold open Q&A sessions like this regularly, every couple of months. Sometimes over Zoom, sometimes in person," he continued. "You can ask me or the board anything. If something seems wrong, we want to know. And for internal issues, we've launched an anonymous hotline for whistleblowers. Any staff member or volunteer can report a problem safely without retaliation. Healing Hands is committed to setting the standard for transparency and responsibility." The woman who'd posed the question gave a quiet, approving smile. "Thank you, Michael. That sounds like meaningful progress." A man seated in the front, one of their largest donors, spoke up unprompted, his voice warm and casual. "I just want to say I admire what you did. Most folks would have tried to cover it up, pretend nothing happened, but you didn't. You tackled it head on. That's why I doubled my donation this year." Several others murmured their agreement. A smattering of applause rippled through the room. Michael felt a quiet glow rise in his chest. It wasn't pride exactly, more like a quiet affirmation that the hard path had been the right one. He lifted his hand slightly, almost shyly. "Thank you," he said. The real gratitude, though, belonged to everyone who had stayed the course with them. Doing what was right hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had been necessary. Healing Hands stood for a mission far greater than any individual scandal or mistake, and together they had kept that mission on track. As the event drew to a close, Michael lingered in the warmly lit room, exchanging smiles, shaking hands, and chatting with attendees. Gone were the hushed doubts and cautious stares. Instead, conversations turned toward the future, projects in the pipeline, ideas to improve the clinics, and the energy of a community rebuilding. An elderly donor clapped a hand on Michael's shoulder on the way out, offering a soft-spoken, "You did the right thing, son. It wasn't easy, but we believe in you." That single gesture carried more weight than Michael could say. On the walk back to his car, he paused, letting the breeze tug at his sleeves while he considered how far things had come. The past 6 months had stretched him to his limits. Helping Healing Hands navigate the fallout and slowly, deliberately regaining its credibility had been a monumental effort. For 4 of those months, he had stepped in as interim executive director, guiding the ship until the board appointed a permanent leader. Afterward, he returned to his own organization, but remained involved in an advisory capacity to make sure the changes held firm. Throughout it all, he had committed himself to reform, rewriting policies, championing transparency, and modeling the accountability the organization desperately needed. There were moments that tested him, when grief bubbled up unexpectedly, like seeing an old photo of Julia tucked into a forgotten folder, or when he had to walk a new partner through the reasons behind the leadership overhaul. But each time he reminded himself, facing the truth, however painful, was better than living a comfortable lie. As for Julia and Daniel, in the immediate wake of the scandal, they disappeared from the non-profit circles they once dominated. Julia had signed the divorce papers and moved out, eventually relocating to her sister's place in another state. Word spread that she was doing low-profile consulting work, far removed from the world of philanthropy, perhaps trying to rebuild quietly. Daniel, too, left the area. Rumors had it he sold what remained of his consultancy and moved into private industry, hoping anonymity might offer some refuge. They had become somber examples in the nonprofit world, an object lesson in how easily personal ambition could derail a noble cause. Michael no longer held any active resentment toward them. If anything, he tried not to dwell on their choices at all. The hurt, once sharp and all-consuming, had cooled into something distant and manageable. He took those emotions and used them, redirected that pain into something worthwhile. He worked to ensure the mission they had jeopardized could never be so easily compromised again. In his personal life, things had simplified. He still lived in the house they once shared. It was quieter now, maybe lonelier, but also calm. There were no more late nights of unanswered texts, no vague explanations of delayed returns. He found peace in the ordinary. Morning jogs, evenings spent reading on the porch, the quiet support of friends who invited him into their lives and reminded him that he wasn't truly alone. One weekend, while sorting through old documents at home, Michael came across a framed quote, a gift from early in his marriage with Julia. It read, "The truth will set you free." Back then, they had taken it as a gentle reminder of the honesty they had pledged to each other. Now it resonated far more deeply. The truth had indeed set things free. It had dismantled their marriage and dragged hard truths into the light. But it had also liberated Michael from illusion, cleared the rot from Healing Hands, and created space for real, lasting growth. He decided to hang the quote up again, this time in his office, a daily touchstone. In the aftermath of it all, Michael found a sense of peace. None of this had been what he wanted, but he had acted according to his conscience, with integrity. Healing Hands was stronger now, more open, more trusted. Staff and donors spoke of a new chapter, one marked not by assumptions of trust, but by its consistent demonstration. As for his own future, that part remained unwritten. Maybe one day he would meet someone who shared his values and could help him rebuild the idea of love founded on truth. Or maybe he would walk alone for a while longer, content in knowing he had stayed honest with himself. Either way, he was at peace. He had served the mission and he had honored his principles. Now standing in his office in the fading twilight, no longer interim but still a guiding force, Michael looked out over the city. Cars passed. People went about their evening routines, unaware of the quiet victory unfolding behind those office windows. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. Truth unyielding, painful, but ultimately redemptive. It had taken nearly everything from him, but in return it gave him clarity, strength, and purpose. By revealing Julia's betrayal and confronting Daniel's misdeeds, he had protected the integrity of a vital cause and reclaimed his own identity. The marriage was gone, but in its place stood a life rebuilt on honesty, on principle, and on earned trust. He reached for a folder on his desk, a proposal to expand rural clinics next year, one of many promises he had made to donors who believed in the work. He opened it with steady hands, his heart hopeful about the impact yet to come. At times, true heroism doesn't wear armor or wield a sword, he reflected, but is found in the quiet courage of those who stand firm against injustice. Michael Grant would never label himself a hero, though those familiar with his journey might say otherwise. He was the kind of man who faced hard truths without turning away, who valued integrity above ease, and through that unwavering commitment, safeguarded a mission that mattered deeply to many. That, he knew, was a legacy worth carrying.